This is episode 122 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at cassidycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Scott Newstock, author of How to Think Like Shakespeare. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
But it was a pretty good decision retroactively to choose stationers like Field and Harrison to publish and promote his poetry.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When William Shakespeare first began his career as a poet, we see evidence in his plays, as well as his life decisions, that he was an ambitious man, almost constantly trying to secure connections with the right people in the right places to move his reputation upwards in society. One very key way we see Shakespeare intentionally seek out forward motion for his career is by his connection to Richard Field. Richard Field is a printer who grew up in Stratford Upon Avon, likely going to the same school as William Shakespeare and even at the same time. The men both grew up to establish professional careers in London, and it seems William Shakespeare sought out Richard Field to publish Venus and Adonis as well as Rape of Lucrece, which under Field's direction, connection, and influence would go on to become the most popular poetry in all of Renaissance Europe. Today, our guest, Adam Hooks, the foremost expert on Richard Field and author of the book Selling Shakespeare, Biography, Bibliography, and the Book Trade, joins us to introduce us to Richard Field, John Harrison, and their bookshop, the White Greyhound, in London that would form the foundation for William Shakespeare's success as a poet. Adam G. Hooks is an associate professor in the Department of English and the Center for the Book at the University of Iowa. He is currently the editor for the Arden Shakespeare 4th series volume of poems. In 2016, Adam curated the exhibition called The Books That Made Shakespeare at the University of Iowa. You can access an online version of that exhibition in the show notes for today's episode. Read more about Adam's teaching and research at the website Ancora, which includes several online essays, as well as some of the amazing resources, materials, and activities and book studies taking place at the University of Iowa. And we will have links to all of this research and more about Adam's work in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Adam. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Richard Field was the son of a tanner in Stratford Upon Avon, the same town where William Shakespeare grew up. Adam, were Richard and William Shakespeare childhood friends?
It's completely possible that they were. Shakespeare's house and Richard Field's house were just around the corner from each other. Richard was about 2.5 years older than Shakespeare was. So they likely would have been going to the grammar school at the same time, even if they weren't always in exactly the same form at school. We don't know anything about Shakespeare's Stratford acquaintances when they were children, but it's totally possible because we know that their fathers knew each other, not only because John Shakespeare was a glover and Henry Field was a tanner, so their professions are related, but Shakespeare's father, John, was one of the people who oversaw the inventory of Richard Field's father when he died in 1592. So it appears that the families probably knew each other.
The Greyhound is a popular symbol for pubs throughout English history. But in this instance, Adam, tell us what the White Greyhound establishment was for Richard Field.
So in London, Richard Field had his print shop in the the Blackfriars district. The White Greyhound was actually the bookshop of his partner, John Harrison, in St. Paul's churchyard. And we know from the existing imprints that Richard Field printed a bunch of books for John Harrison. So that was a pretty vital partnership, especially early in Richard Field's career. And it's where the books that he produced would have been sold wholesale from the White Greyhound. So even though it was not technically his own shop, it was very important for his career.
I've read many scholarly articles that suggest Shakespeare never wanted his books to be printed commercially, and they present the first folio, which was published after his death, as evidence that Shakespeare was in the performance business as opposed to the publication business. Adam, what does your research into Shakespeare's connection with Richard Field suggest about the assumption that Shakespeare didn't want to print his own books?
So I can say a couple of things about this. The first thing is that we do not have much of an idea of what Shakespeare's desires or ambitions might have been as far as publishing any of his works. Clearly, the two narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, were presented to be printed. They include dedications signed by Shakespeare himself. So it's quite possible that early in his career, there was some ambition to be a man in print, to have his works published. The second thing I will say is that what Richard Field has always offered scholars since the 18th century is some kind of bibliographical evidence that would demonstrate Shakespeare's desire to have his poems printed and published. The fact that they both come from Stratford Upon Avon, the fact that Richard Field really did not print English poetry. This was a kind of outlier amongst his printed output. So if the two were acquainted, then what Richard Field offers is this kind of biographical, bibliographical locus that allows for the identification of Shakespeare's intention to be a printed poet.
Adam's research on the White Greyhound, which I will link to in today's show notes, says that Richard Field sold copies of Shakespeare's poems from the White Greyhound, not just for a little while, but for a full 20 years he was in this business. Adam, did Shakespeare see any royalties from all of this published work?
Absolutely not. Unfortunately, the systems of intellectual property and the precursor to what would eventually become copyright simply did not exist in the same way that they do now. It's very likely that Shakespeare would have been offered maybe some kind of modest fee for selling the poems initially to Richard Field and to John Harrison. But he certainly would not have taken in any part of the profits that Field and Harrison would have received. And you're exactly right. John Harrison, in particular, kept publishing Lucrece for a couple of decades. And these were extraordinarily popular poems. Venus and Adonis was the most popular English poem in the entire Renaissance. So it certainly made Shakespeare's reputation. It just did not help his bank account.
That seems like a tragedy in itself. In this article, Shakespeare at the White Greyhound that Adam wrote is referring to Shakespeare hiring Richard Field in 1593. Now, that's the same year Shakespeare wrote Richard III. And Adam calls this hiring of Richard Field a, quote, the first heir of his invention, end quote. Adam, what was Richard Field hired by Shakespeare to do?
So the first heir of my invention is a phrase that comes directly from the dedication letter that Shakespeare attached to Venus and Adonis. So to kind of reflect back a bit on one of the other questions earlier, there seems to be an acknowledgement by Shakespeare that this is my first kind of published work. This is the first thing I'm presenting in this particular manner. What Richard Field would have been hired to do, he was primarily a printer rather than a publisher. And that distinction is really crucial in this case, because the printer is someone who is paid to actually print the pages of the book. So he would have been responsible, he and other members of his shop, for composing the text and for actually printing the sheets. The publisher, on the other hand, was the person responsible for the money. The publisher decides that something is going to be printed and either prints it himself or hires someone to print it for him. So starting in 1594, Richard Field actually turned over the titles to both Venus and Lucrece to John Harrison. And so Harrison became the publisher, but then for the next few years continued to hire Richard Field to print subsequent editions of Venus and Adonis.
Adam writes that the title page from Venus and Adonis offers a window into the intent of publishing these poems with Richard Field. Adam, what is the motto you examined in the title page, and why did you describe it as both bold and audacious by Shakespeare?
So the motto is Latin, and it's taken from Ovid's Amores, kind of his scandalous love poems, which is completely suitable and appropriate for an erotic work like Venus and Adonis that derives from an episode from Ovid's Metamorphoses. The English translation of the motto reads, "Let base conceited wits admire vile things, fair Phoebus lead me to the Muses' springs." So that in itself, you can tell, is a kind of bold assertion about the poet's prowess, the sophistication of his art, the invocation of a classical muse. So even if you didn't know your Ovid, you would certainly understand that this is a suitable statement for a young poet to make. Now, going beyond that a bit more, Richard Field and John Harrison produced some of the first editions of Ovid to be printed in England. So if you walked into the White Greyhound, what you would see is not only Shakespeare's poem with that motto on the title page, but you could also pick up a copy of the Metamorphoses, which is the source story, and the Amores, which is the source of the motto. To go even one step further, this particular elegy from the Amores, from which the quotation is taken from, was printed at the front of an extraordinarily popular printed commonplace book that was widely used in England. So choosing this particular poem to serve as the source of the motto would have been a very clear marker of someone's ambition. And in fact, a few years later, Christopher Marlowe's translation of Ovid's Amores appeared, which was extremely popular. And Ben Jonson, Shakespeare's other great contemporary, in his play Poetaster, actually has the character of Ovid writing this particular poem on stage at the beginning of the play. So there may not be anything especially Shakespearean about the motto, but it would have been very legible to certain segments of the reading public.
Now, you alluded to this earlier with your suggestion that Shakespeare owes Richard Field and John Harrison some debt in a way for their promotion of his career. I mean, Venus and Adonis being the most popular poem of the Renaissance is quite an accomplishment. But knowing that the word poet was used to describe anyone with an art for words, including a dramatist, as Shakespeare seems to have been particularly focused upon with his career, Adam was publishing his poems at the White Greyhound, an early modern approach to what we might think of today as entrepreneurship or even self-promotion.
That is a really good question. It's a bit tricky to answer, but I'm going to give it a shot. The supposed connection between Richard Field and Shakespeare is only really about the moment of composition. It's that initial moment. That's what most people have been focused on, is getting Venus and Adonis into print. What did that particular moment do? By working with Richard Field, however, and Field's partnership with John Harrison, I did just allude to this, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a better shop from which to sell an Ovidian poem than the White Greyhound, because that's where you could also find Ovid's complete works. So that Ovidian vogue for narrative erotic poems in the 1590s would have been very visible in its ambitions to translate and adapt Ovid into English. And also, Richard Field was a very well-connected printer. He worked for Lord Burleigh, basically Queen Elizabeth's Secretary of State, on a few occasions. He printed King James's poetry. So those elements, kind of Richard Field's own connections within the book trade and within English culture, is sometimes overlooked in our rush to get to Shakespeare. But it was a pretty good decision retroactively to choose stationers like Field and Harrison to publish and promote his poetry.
Which seems to fit with what we think we know about Shakespeare in terms of his focus on ambition and trying to seek out these connections that would put him in the right places to get noticed, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Do we have records of how Shakespeare's poems performed as marketable products in comparison to these other books that Field was publishing at the White Greyhound? I mean, you suggested that Shakespeare's poems were kind of an oddity among what they usually carried. So how did it do?
Well, as I said, Venus and Adonis was spectacularly successful. It is difficult, if not impossible, to overstate how important that poem was to Shakespeare's reputation during his lifetime. Venus and Adonis, in particular, got passed around to a number of different stationers who all capitalized on its popularity. And Lucrece was also just as popular as Shakespeare's most popular play, which in that period was Henry IV, Part 1. And beyond just the sheer success of the poem in the marketplace, we know that it was very popular among readers and writers because there are so many allusions in other texts to Venus and Adonis. Quotations from the poem appear in printed commonplace books, which means that it was a very popular source for other people to draw on as well, which makes sense. This just shows how good of a Renaissance reader and writer Shakespeare was, because he knew how to incorporate and adapt Ovid for his own purposes. And then in turn, he was known as a particularly sweet writer. That's the term that was often used to describe his style. And this goes back to the fundamental metaphor of commonplacing, which is you're supposed to imitate the bees and collect the nectar and produce your own honey. And then in the kind of cycle of textuality, other readers and writers imitating bees drew on Shakespeare's honeyed style for their own purposes.
Showing people how it was done, even in the 16th century.
Exactly.
Adams' publication calls attention to the fact that we cannot know whether Richard Field worked directly with Shakespeare or not, or even if Shakespeare ever went to the White Greyhound personally. Yet Adam also writes about the publications of Sir John Harington published at the White Greyhound, describing original documents from which Richard Field worked to produce printed copies of Harington's writing. And those copies are significant because they contain what Adam calls instructions to Field concerning layout and typography in Harington's hand. Adam, explain for us your research into the publication process. When an author like Shakespeare worked with Richard Field, was it necessary to be as involved as Harington appears to have been for Field to have published his poems? Can we hold out hope there are notes in Shakespeare's hand somewhere?
That would be really great. Although I have a feeling that if we found Shakespeare's notes to Venus and Adonis, it would probably cause more problems than solve them.
So much research would just explode right
Exactly.
there.
I mean, I would love to see that. So Sir John Harington is a bit of an outlier because he's the Queen's godson. He was extraordinarily involved in a lot of his publications. He produced many of them as special presentation copies to pass out to various personages at court. And we just happen to have this very rare kind of evidence, which is the manuscripts that Richard Field and his printers used to print, for example, Harrington's translation of Orlando Furioso. And we even have Harrington specifying exactly what kind of type he wants to be used for his book. That's rare in a couple of different ways. It's relatively rare for an author to be that engaged in the printing process. And it's also extremely rare for that evidence to survive, for the manuscripts to survive. So I would say it certainly demonstrates that Richard Field was a skillful printer who was willing to collaborate with an author, but the cooperation of the author was not necessary at all. And that goes back to the fact that authors did not have any copyright in their works. Once it was sold to a printer, the printer owned it and could do with it exactly what he wanted. So whether Shakespeare collaborated in this way or not, Field was a skillful enough printer that he probably would have been more satisfied to just get on with the work himself as the skilled tradesman that he was and not have an author hanging around. Once upon a time, it was thought that maybe Shakespeare proofread his poems, but that's long since been abandoned as a form of wish fulfillment because Field and his compositors would have kind of imposed a house style as far as punctuation and spelling very often. So
Adam's research goes on to suggest that there's a connection between Shakespeare and his famous patron Henry Wriothesley to be found in Richard Field. Adam, there is a dedication to Henry Wriothesley in one of these copies of Venus and Adonis that Field published that suggests that Shakespeare was either trying to impress Wriothesley or that Wriothesley had requested this be written on his behalf. Do you have any research into which of these came first? Was this trying to attract him, or was this written at his request?
I would say that the poem came before the patron in all likelihood. You don't necessarily write a lengthy poem like Venus and Adonis, or its even lengthier companion, Lucrece, just because someone asks you to. It's plausible that that might have happened. But the more likely explanation is that for one reason or another, whether it was ambition, a fondness for Ovid, plague, shutting the theater, Shakespeare decided to write these two poems, which ended up being dedicated to Wriothesley, the young Earl of Southampton. It could be the other way around. We have no way of knowing if the poet and the patron ever knew each other or ever met or corresponded. We have no evidence to suggest that one way or the other. We do know that there is another poem, a Latin poem on the Narcissus myth that was also dedicated to young Wriothesley. And that may actually have been a kind of commissioned work from a member of the Burleigh circle. But even that is not quite clear, so it doesn't provide an analog to Shakespeare's poem. Now, the interesting connection to Richard Field is that at this time, young Wriothesley was the ward of none other than Lord Burleigh, who we know worked with Richard Field. And so knowing that connection, it's just as possible or plausible that someone like Field would have suggested Wriothesley as a suitable patron for this kind of work. Because at this time, we kind of assume that Wriothesley was always the fabulous, glorious figure at court that we know from paintings of him. But he was very young. He didn't really have a lot of access to money yet, and he wasn't known as a patron of poets yet. There is one tiny little indication that they may have had some kind of commerce between the two of them, because Shakespeare also dedicated Lucrece to Wriothesley, and he seems to indicate that there was some kind of warrant of favor that was demonstrated to him in the previous poem, which might indicate that Shakespeare actually did receive some form of patronage from Wriothesley. We just have no idea. But that idea was so strong that in the late 18th century, the great forger William Henry Ireland decided that he would write a letter from Wriothesley to Shakespeare. And there's another apocryphal story that has Shakespeare receiving a just obscene amount of money that could never have actually been the case. But those kinds of apocryphal stories or forged stories are so appealing because we want to find evidence of a connection between the poet and his patron.
I know that we would love to explore this topic further and to look into the life of Richard Field and publishing in the 16th century, especially as it relates to Shakespeare. Adam, what are some of your favorite books and resources you can recommend we use to learn more?
I would be happy to offer a few suggestions, starting, I suppose, with the first chapter in my own book, Selling Shakespeare, which aggregates a lot of information about Richard Field and his partnership with John Harrington. The classic study of Richard Field as a printer throughout his whole career, not just the brief moment in which he was involved in the Shakespeare business, comes from the 1930s, I believe, A.E.M. Curwood, with an exhaustive study of Richard Field as a printer. Interestingly, Curwood was a woman writing at a time in which, shall we say, it wasn't always very easy to be a woman bibliographer. So I always point that one out. Doug Brewster has a more recent essay in Shakespeare Quarterly called Lady Eight, which is based in part on Curwood's essay and examines, among other things, the print shop of Richard Field and his master, Thomas Vautralier. There's also an examination of some of the printer's ornaments, which I find particularly, I've always found Field's printer's ornaments particularly attractive, so much so that I have his device tattooed on my arm. I really am the Richard Field guy.
That's when you're committed to your research.
Exactly. And the other place that I would point people towards is a very recent, just published book by Jason Scott Warren called Shakespeare's First Reader, which is about the first recorded purchaser of a work by Shakespeare by Richard Stoneleigh, a member of the Exchequer, who records buying Venus and Adonis in 1593. So it's the first time that we have a record of that, of someone paying to buy a Shakespeare work. One of the first chapters in that book is called Shopping for Shakespeare, and it kind of gives us a lot of great commercial context for the environment in which Shakespeare's poem first appeared.
Those are excellent resources, and we will link to all of these, as well as Adam's book that you should certainly check out in the show notes for today's episode. Now, Adam, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, considering what we've been talking about today, I would choose the book that I kind of think that Shakespeare would have chosen, which is a copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Ovid was the most important classical writer for Shakespeare. It's a crucial context for understanding Venus and Adonis, particularly. And Ovid is a damn fine poet. So I would happily while away my time reading Shakespeare and Ovid.
You would definitely not get bored on your deserted island, for sure.
Exactly.
What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I have 2 or 3 different projects. As luck would have it, I am editing Shakespeare's poems for the 4th series of the Art and Shakespeare. So I will continue to be the Richard Field guy as I edit Venus and Lucrece, along with The Phoenix and the Turtle, which Richard Field also printed a few years later in 1601, and the other poems like Lover's Complaint that make up the corpus of Shakespeare's poems, except for the sonnets. I don't have to deal with the sonnets, but I do have everything else. I am working on a book project called Shakespeare's Bones, which begins with Shakespeare's epitaph carved on his gravestone and uses that as a way to tell what I'm calling the story of the biography of Shakespeare's death. So I'm definitely excited about that particular project, and it's kind of overlaps with the Arden 4 poems. And then I have a much longer term project called Faking Shakespeare, which is a kind of history of Shakespearean authenticity and forgery. Beyond that, I will put a plug in for a digital project that I co-direct with Zach Lesser from the University of Pennsylvania, which is the Shakespeare Census, a website which offers information on individual copies of Shakespeare's poems and plays. And this is the first time since Henrietta Bartlett's census back in the 1930s that a census has been updated, and it continues to grow. We're extremely proud of it, and I use it all the time. Zach and I both had different reasons for wanting to update the census, so we decided to do it and make it available for free to everyone around the world.
That's fabulous. Well, we will get the link to that from Adam and make sure that we share the link where you can explore Shakespeare Census as well as these other projects. Adam, it's nice to know you're staying just a little bit busy, and we'll look forward to following all of these exciting projects you've got in the works. Thank you so much for being here, as well as taking us through the life of Richard Field and his impact on the career of William Shakespeare. This has been fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure to spend a few minutes talking about Richard Field to you today.
Learn more about Richard Field, Henry Risley, John Harrison, and the White Greyhound, all packed into the show notes for today's episode. Find all of these resources at cassidycash.com/episode 122. That's cassidycash.com/EP122. How would you like to see the video of this week's interview? You can watch this interview as well as other exclusive interviews not available anywhere else right inside That Shakespeare Life app. That's right! That Shakespeare Life is now streaming on our very own digital app. We are very excited to make this available, and not only can you stream podcast episodes anywhere you go, but the app contains exclusive content like activities, games, documentary shorts, expert interviews, and animated plays, all free from ads and available anywhere you might be. You can learn Shakespeare's history from the experts who know him best while you're in the carpool line, cooking dinner, or even while you're working out. Take Shakespeare history with you wherever you go, all without any commercials. Download the app now at cassidycash.com/experience. That's cassidycash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.